what we're really talking about is outcomes. I think we can agree quickly of like, hey, if there's a reasonable obstacle that can be removed for a child to help increase their performance, great, let's talk about that. But to get to a point where all racial groups are performing the same, I'm not sure that's the right outcome to look at.
Equity was explained to me before I left teaching, was treating people with the understanding, treating students with the understanding that not all people come from the same starting point. And, it was kind of understandable back then. It was like, okay, I can have additional sympathy for a kid, or provide additional support for a kid who may come from a disadvantaged background. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that, right? I think that's what we do as compassionate people. But now, of course, what equity means more and more is that, hey, we've got to find a way to get everyone to the same finish line. And when you say getting everyone to the same finish line, that brings a whole lot of additional things that have to happen, and really have to kind of bring down the achievers, right? To raise up the non-achievers, if you will. We published a study in our magazine, Teachers of Vision magazine, a few years ago, from a scholar named William James, who's someone that I would love to introduce you to if you're not already familiar with William James. It's Jeynes. He wrote an article saying that the achievement gap in education completely disappears. When I say achievement gap, I mean, historically speaking, there's just been an achievement gap between different racial groups, right, in their school achievement. He said it completely disappears when you factor out things like two-parent families and serious commitment to faith. So if you look at just kids of two-parent families and kids who have a serious commitment to faith, or families that do, the achievement gap completely disappears. And he shows that in our research we publish in our magazine. And so, wow, I'd love to spend more time talking about those kinds of things, right?
Well, and I think that's really an important point. I want to make sure that it doesn't blow by people too quickly. We just recently did a training at a Christian school that is kind of trying to explain equity trainings in the educational context, and how do we think about this from a Christian point of view. And I think that what people need to understand is that how educational equity is often couched is strictly within the framework of race. Let's add up all these numbers and look at achievement gaps in terms of race. We see that Black and brown students are performing at this level in math and reading and language skills. White students, Asian students are at a different level. Therefore, this disparity must be due to racism. Now, there's a thoughtful way of going about that discussion where, we could have that conversation. We could ask more penetrating questions. What's happening here? Is this about neighborhoods? Is, that kind of thing? Is it about funding? But then the question is what other factors are there? And that is the conversation that we think is not happening enough.
Well, I think that it's because so many people now borrow from Kendi, and Kendi has moved into being the end all be all in this conversation. And according to Kendi, any inequity is an injustice. And so if there's an inequity in reading among Black and white or brown and white, then there must be an injustice. And that doesn't necessarily answer very important, necessary questions. We can't just look at the data and say, well, the data says there's an inequity, so the data means that there's an injustice. No, the data, it could be the data, but we need to go in and really do some research to understand the data in a deeper level.
And I think that this is also another thing I want to make sure doesn't blow by people is what we're really talking about is outcomes. So how do we, all of us are in favor of, I think we can agree quickly of hey, if there's a reasonable obstacle that can be removed for a child to help increase their performance, great, let's talk about that. But to get to a point where all racial groups are performing the same, I'm not sure that's the right outcome to look at. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, I agree completely. These are complex causal features, right? And race may play a role in some things, but that certainly isn't the be all end all. And I would argue many times it's not even the number one explanatory factor. I think, as the data has shown, fatherlessness is a far bigger explanatory factor for outcomes than is race. And yet this modern CRT driven agenda says, no, it's all about race. Everything's about race. Every human interaction comes down to being fundamentally about race. And that's such a narrow way to look at things, and really going to sell our students short.
But I also think that there's this misconception that we're being sold that even if everything were equal, we would get the same results student to student, that we would actually have these equal outcomes. And I just don't think so. I think that individuals are individuals, and I might just suck at science, and there's nothing that I can do about that because my brain just isn't wired that way. And so even with everything being equal, I don't know that we're going to get the same results.
And people are complicated, and factors are complex into what goes into making a successful student. There's a great comment on YouTube. It says people in general minimize complex systems into a single factor. In this case, we're talking about race. No nuance. Complex systems are complex because they are dependent on many factors simultaneously. I would also add to that, people are complex. People are not mathematical formulas where you do these steps and then out comes a successful student. Like, it's way more complicated than that.